Okay. Got it.
Yep. All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's 1W-MINDS seminar. We are very happy to have Professor Misha Kilmer here to talk to us today. She's a professor at Tufts, the Tufts Data and Intensive Studies Center faculty fellow currently, deputy director of ICERM, I gather, and fellow of SIAM as well, among many other honors. She is also an expert in tensor methods computationally and otherwise, and we're really happy to see what current work has been going on in that direction. So I'll turn things over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction and for the invitation to speak. This is some joint work. The first author on this work is Fan Tian, who is my current graduate student at Tufts in the math department. Eric Miller is a faculty member at Tufts in the electrical and computer engineering department, and he directs our Tufts AI Center. Avani Patra is a faculty in math and in computer science, and is the director for the Data Intensive Studies Center. As just mentioned, I hope you don't mind, I take my 30 seconds to say something about this other position I hold. So I am a deputy director at the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics. That's at Brown University in Providence. And as a deputy director, one of my jobs is to advertise that we have lots of really cool programming workshops, semester programs, and so forth, and would encourage you to go and click on some links and see if there's something you would be interested in applying for. But also we solicit proposals for new workshops, new semester programs, and I'm always happy to speak with you about the possibility of putting a proposal together. So with that said, this work was funded by our Tufts Tripods grant from the NSF. And the first thing I want to do, because this is one of those talks where the pictures really go miles in terms of explaining what's happening. So the graphics are really important, and Fan put some really incredible graphics together, and I wanted to say a special shout out to that. She has a good skill for that, but also I wanted to say that this whole project really is due to Fan. She came in to Tufts knowing something about this thing called the Tensor BM-Decomposition. I'd never heard of it before, and so this is the end result of our all getting familiar with this and pushing it through to an application. The main reference, if you're interested, it's been submitted to a journal, but the archive preprint is available. So just to give you a heads up of what I'll be talking about today, I'm just going to start with a brief background and notation to set the stage, and then give a motivation. I will have to tell you what this BM product is, and what we want to accomplish with this. And in particular, I want to show that we have established a generative model for these the types of video we're interested in compressing and separating. We'll talk a little bit about that. Give an algorithm for a very efficient algorithm in some sense for doing the decomposition that we need. And then I have several illustrations of how well this can work in practice before I finish up with the summary. So throughout the talk today, notationally, if there's a vector, it's just a bold lowercase. If it's a matrix, it's a bold uppercase. The script or the calligraphic script will mean a third order tensor. So in this case, an object that's an M by P by N array. Tensors can be multi-way arrays, so they can have much higher order than third order. We believe some of this will extend to higher order, although I don't know how efficiently some of the computations will scale. But for all intents and purposes, everything, when I say tensor in this talk, I mean a third order tensor object. So the particular ways that we're going to be interested in slicing and dicing our third order cube are taking that third order object and imagining it is chopped up either by its frontal slices, by its lateral slices, or by its horizontal slices. And frontal slices, it's pretty obvious. If I'm just, I take one frontal slice and this tensor is m by p by n, then the frontal slices individually are m by p matrices, if I look at them one at a time. And I've used this MATLAB style indexing to indicate that. So the colons just mean I'm running over all the row indices and all the column indices, and I'm holding the third index fixed. Alternatively, I could slice in lateral slices, so sideways. And if I do that, that would be like fixing the middle index, running over all the row indices and all indices in depth. Horizontal slices, something similar, right? I hold the first index fixed and I run, the colon notation means run over everything. You can kind of see from the pictures, but just to make concrete notation that I'll be using to be able to go back and forth between the lateral and or horizontal slices to matrices is this squeeze notation. Squeeze is actually a command in MATLAB that would take something, for example, a single lateral slice and turn it into a matrix, or a horizontal slice and turn it into a matrix. And it turns out to be very convenient to have this command handy when we start talking about some of our algorithms. Okay, so here is the motivating example. So if I have a single digital image, and that digital image is a grayscale image, it's really a matrix, right? So here's an example of an M by N matrix, if you will, which is an image. The entries in this image are from 0 to 255, and it's 120 by 160 columns. So if I have multiple of these things, for example, frames in a video, like I'm advancing right now, I can put those individual frames into a tensor. The way that I'm going to do that is to put them in as lateral slices. So just to remind you, the lateral slices are this middle picture here. So in this case, time is going across the columns, and the spatial dimensions are the first dimension and the dimension into the board here, okay? So what you notice is that as I'm going through the frames in this image, not a lot is changing about the road and the surrounding area. So this is a video that comes in MATLAB as a tool for folks to play with. And you know, there are some subtle changes in the background. There's like maybe some lighting changes and so on and so forth. But the main thing that's happening is that cars are coming down the stretch towards the front of the screen. And so my goal today is to treat these such videos in a way in which we can separate what is the stationary background from the non-stationary background. So the stationary is the background, the non-stationary, which we call the foreground, is in this case would just be the cars. Can I pull those things apart? And I want to do it in a way that respects this tensor structure in which I'm holding this video. And moreover, the separation I want to do, I want to separate into the stationary video and a non-stationary video, and I want compressed representations of each of those things at the same time. Now, traditionally, these traditionally these surveillance type videos are treated in a different way, not with tensors, but rather as matrices. So you could imagine taking each one of those frames, and instead of dropping that in as a lateral slice in a tensor, I can unfold that and unstack it, and that becomes just a single column in a matrix. So now I have a tall matrix with mn entries corresponding to all the pixels, and p is the time dimension that's going across the columns. And so, traditionally, we pose this as a matrix problem, try to approximate this video matrix, if you will, as something that's low rank plus sparse. And there's prior work, for example, on robust PCA for doing something like this. But the motivation for this other dynamic mode decomposition approach that I am going to discuss a little bit more in detail later is to achieve the same kind of quality decomposition much faster than the robust PCA type algorithms can work. So we're going to do a comparison of our method to a DMD-based approach, and we're going to actually add a tensor-based component to a DMD approach. But in all fairness, the DMD approach, at least the way that I understand it, is that it wasn't necessarily designed for compression, but rather solving this background plus sparse component. My claim is that we should expect to get more out of a tensor-based approach because we're kind of respecting the natural nature of the data in which we collected. We're keeping the integrity of those frames in the tensor. Of course, what do I mean by tensor-based approach? That's an obvious question. There are a slew of tensor decomposition methods. If you go down the rabbit hole of Googling tensor decomposition, you'll come up with a dizzying array of acronyms and so forth that describe some of these algorithms. Some of the more well-known, for example, the candy comp parafac or the CP decomposition, which dates back to 1927, which attempts to take a third-order tensor and approximate it as a sum of what are called rank 1 tensors. Here, the idea of a rank 1 tensor is complete analogy to the matrix-based case. Instead of an outer product of matrices, you sort of have this three-way outer product of vectors. So it's basically, if I look at one of these little chicken feet, that tensor is a rank 1 matrix all the way sliced front to back. And the green vector here provides the individual weightings to each one of those rank 1 matrices. There are plenty of applications where this method is the right method to use, sometimes with constraints like non-negativity and so forth. But it is nice from the point of view of this is what I would call an orientation independent tensor decomposition. If I permute this cube and do this decomposition, it's basically just the same as permuting this individual the individual factors in this sum. But there are problems as it work on it. No, it can be slow to converge. You have to usually use an alternating least squares algorithm to find these factors. You don't know what the right number of terms is a priori. Finding the tensor rank is an NP-hard problem and so forth. And for this particular application, it's not quite the right choice. Another option would be to use the Tucker decomposition, in this case, a Tucker 3 decomposition. More often than not, in an application, you would use an HOSVD variant of this that's due to these authors. And the idea being trying to achieve some kind of representation and or compression of this tensor cube using a smaller dimensional core tensor and 3 individual factor matrices, which, excuse me, for example, in using HOSVD, you could constrain the factor matrices to have orthonormal columns, which is something that the CP decomposition didn't offer. Still not quite the right tool for us. This is completely, again, sort of orientation independent. It really doesn't, it's sort of agnostic to what these dimensions mean in some sense. Another decomposition method is something that I worked on with a slew of collaborators, where we define actually a multiplication between tensor objects of the right dimension. And in that tensor, we call it the tensor star M product framework, we can actually do things like a tensor singular value decomposition that looks and feels like the matrix-based tensor decomposition, at least in the way that I've shown it in this cartoon here, where the singular tubes play the role of singular values. The lateral slice of the U tensor and the V tensor are orthogonal under this type of multiplication. Okay, so that's an option, but this is orientation dependent in the sense that it does matter how you stack the cube, and everything follows from once you fix the dimension orientation. So in considering what we might want for this application, do we care about this idea of orientation independence or dependence? How do we want to interpret the modes? We have a video image, right? So we have 2 spatial dimensions and a time, and somehow I want to respect that. But if you have an application where you want to use these tensor methods, you think that they might be useful, you have to go through this list of questions and decide, what do I need? What's less important? There will be trade-offs in every case. There is no one-size-fits-all tensor decomposition method. And in particular for this application, orientation dependence is somewhat relevant, but I don't really care so much about orthogonality. I care kind of, can I compress these images? I don't think an image is really an orthogonal entity. And I want something that, I can do reasonably quickly on my laptop. And this new decomposition I'll describe now gives some of these desired features. So the BM product dates back to a paper from 1990, and the idea is as follows. So I will need 3 tensors, A, B, and C. The one common dimension to all 3 tensors is this dimension L here. You'll see it here, here, and here. So this is L is the number of lateral slices for A, the depth slices for B, and the number of horizontal slices for C. And here you can see the other pairwise matching between M here, N here, and here, P here. So the BM product then of these, this triple of tensors, you can define it entry-wise. So the ijk entry would be given by this sum. So now you can see why it's important that middle dimension matched in all 3 tensors. The result will be M by P by N. And yeah, so that looks interesting. But it's a little more interesting if we start to look not at the definition component-wise, but more on the larger scale of things. For example, if L is 1, so that essentially script A is a lateral slice. Here I've got a picture in object. B is a frontal slice object, and C is a horizontal slice object. Then this kind of this BM product is essentially like a three-way outer product of matrices. That's one way that you can kind of visualize what's going on. And so another way to look at it that sort of starts to get to, you know, the heart of the decomposition itself and where the compression might be, is to look at this this L, the second mode, sorry, the L index. So this BM product of A, B, and C, I can write out as individual BM products in terms of the components of A, B, and C, which are essentially, for all intents and purposes, matrices, right? So this is a picture here. And if I have X defined this way, then it turns out I can think of X as defined as a sum of these individual, what we'll call BM rank 1 objects, okay? So sort of similar in feel to the CP decomposition. What is known about the BM rank of a third order tensor up till now, certain, you know, that it should be defined as the minimum number of BM outer product objects, like I just showed in the last picture, that sum up to X. Like CP, it's hard to know what that is going to be a priori. It was shown in a paper in 2020 that the BM rank of X is certainly bounded by the minimum of the 3 dimensions of the tensor. One other feature, though, that will end up becoming the heart of our algorithm is this notion of transposes, which are really permutations. So I can take my original tensor and I can permute it once or twice or 3 times to get it back. The command to do it, if you're a MATLAB programmer, would look like this using the permute command, but it's basically specifying the 3 different cyclic permutations on the indices. Let's see, right, so transpose of the BM product of these 3 objects, I can write as a BM product of individual transposes, because remember, these things are themselves tensors. So this is all nice and well defined. So the first result I can give you based on some of this notation as we started to think about it. First of all, we can tighten this upper bound a little bit in some cases on the BM rank. And what we're going to do is we'll take our tensor X, and it's m by p by n. So each one of the frontal slices will be an m by p matrix. And so R is here is the minimum of m and p. That would be the maximum rank that you could hope to have for any one of those frontal slices. So let's go through and take a singular value decomposition of each one of those frontal slices. And the K's indicate which frontal slice I'm working on, and T is the vector component, the index into the left or right singular matrix. So it turns out then, you know, we look at this and we say, all right, well, each one of these frontal slices has rank R sub k, which is less than or equal to R. I claim that we can, knowing this, we can take this expression and represent X using a BM decomposition if I set L to be the maximum of those, of all those ranks, front to back of those slices. And the way to do it is just to make an assignment to the individual components of the A, B, and the C tensor. The B tensor is not so interesting. It's a rank 1. Every frontal slice of B is going to be a rank 1 matrix of all ones. But putting the rest of the pieces into the A and the C tensor, then we can prove that X is in fact a BM product of those 3 tensors, and that the BM rank is indeed this L, which is the maximum of all those ranks, which may indeed be smaller than the minimum of any of the 3 dimensions, of the front 2 dimensions. And because I can make the exact same argument for X transpose or X transpose transpose, then we know formally that the BM rank actually can't exceed the smallest one of any of those, smallest rank of any of those slice-wise decompositions under any one of those 3 permutations. So that potentially can, in some cases, tighten up the best upper bound on the BM rank. One thing we discovered as playing with this, which maybe is not a surprise if you are familiar with CP and HOSVD, is that there is some non-uniqueness with a BM product decomposition. In fact, different diagonal scalings of the individual slices will give rise to exactly the same representation if I do it in the right way. So the factors aren't going to be unique in this decomposition. As an aside, because this does sort of resemble the CP decomposition, then I should take a moment to just mention that if we restrict every one of the matrix slices in the A, the B, and the C tensor to be a rank 1 matrix, then this BM rank L approximation is in fact a CP decomposition of rank L. And moreover, if I know what a CP decomposition for my tensor looks like, then I can use the minimal rank over all the factor matrices to get an upper bound on the BM rank for my BM decomposition. Sort of just an aside, but a good place to mention these connections. Okay, I said it wasn't unique, but I want to do something with it anyway. So I'm thinking about, I have put these frames in as lateral slices to my tensor. Now I'm going to give a generative model showing the objects moving on a static background are well described by this low BM rank representation. So the key observation for actually doing this is to observe that lateral slices in X can be represented actually, if I think of them as individual matrices, so I take a slice out of here and I squeeze it into a matrix, they are diagonally weighted sums of, lack of a better word, dictionary matrices. So if I think of the A sub i's as dictionary matrices, then I have pre and post multiplied A sub I by diagonal weighting matrices, and that will give me an XJ, if in fact this equality holds. So we're starting with a very simple generative model, would be assuming an object of just like a 1 by 1 pixel. It has intensity alpha, and it's moving on a constant background, initially at, say, position I1, J1. Then the first slice of my video would be represented, at least in matrix form, as, and I'm just doing it to show the relationship to the previous slide, identity matrix essentially times a background image times an identity matrix plus alpha times a diagonal matrix that has only one non-zero entry, a matrix E, which is a matrix of all ones, a weighting of my background image, and post multiplied by a diagonal matrix that only has one non-zero entry. So if in the next frame that object moves into pixel position I2, J2, the second frame has a similar kind of representation. Identity Y identity plus alpha times diagonal matrix with one entry, the same matrix here as appears in frame 1 times another diagonal matrix, and so on and so forth. So basically, if I go back and look at this observation, what I'm seeing here is this small generative model shows that I can that I've got a pixel moving in that I can represent this in a BM decomposition of two terms. So here's a graphical illustration. If I this is the actual pixel image, then these are the corresponding locations that I'm going to put into the second frontal slice of my tensor B and the second horizontal slice of my tensor C. And as I move the pixel in the image, more entries in the B and the C tensor are filling in with non-zero entries until what I end up with, again, is a decomposition of this tensor as this background image A1 is in this slice A1 times weightings of tensors of all ones here, plus alpha times a fixed modification to the background image, and the B and the C2 here as well. Okay, so very simple form. I've written down the case for these slides for just a single pixel, but this can be generalized to groups of pixels, different intensities, all moving. But the basic idea is that a small BM rank can actually capture this. I don't need very many terms to capture this motion on the background. So the algorithm we want to solve, it's we want to find an A tilde, which has a low BM rank. And then what we want to try and do is separate the background from the foreground. The background will just be the first term in the sum, and then everything else is the motion. How do we get an estimate of L? Well, if I look back at this picture, it maybe is obvious that if I look in this dimension along the first frontal slice, second frontal slice, third frontal slice, those are very low rank objects, rank 1 or 2 or 3. In practice for a real image, I expect that the ranks will fall off very quickly. So we go back to the idea of a slice-wise SVD of our tensor, and we look at all the singular values across all the frontal slices, decide on a truncation tolerance that's meaningful. And then I can, as I showed earlier, wrap this into a BM rank L approximation by judiciously placing the singular vectors into the A and the C tensors, and then taking the B tensor to be a tensor of all ones. So that's gives me a starting guess, and now I want to do an alternating least squares routine to refine this approximation. So I'm going to start by updating B, since B is just this rank 1 tensor. And so in order to think about how to do that, it pays to look under the hood at the problem and uncover the structure that we can use to make this computationally efficient. So here we can observe that the components, and that should actually say X. The components that we need to solve the least squares problem are all here in this picture. The main thing I want to point out, because it's not all that digestible immediately, is just that these are individual P by L, and L, remember, is a small dimension, decoupled matrices on the diagonal here. And so solving this problem for B is equivalent to just solving this linear least squares problem with the H matrix that I have on this slide. But since that H matrix is block diagonal, then really I only need to solve MN very small linear least squares problems. So this is entirely parallelizable if the dimensions weren't going to programming it that way. And moreover, once I have the routine to just do this and solve for B, then I use those nice cyclic symmetries to solve for the other components, right? I can alternate. First I find B, then I hold my current A and B fixed and try to optimize for C by solving this problem, which uses all the hardware I developed to solve problem 1. Next, I hold B and C fixed, solve for A, and so forth. In terms of convergence, we can use similar techniques to that used to analyze the alternating least squares for the CP decomposition. And so we can show that this produces a monotonically decreasing sequence of iterates, that it's effectively a nonlinear Gauss-Seidel iteration. Not surprisingly, when it runs into potential problems and slow convergence, similar to ALS for CP. But we get something out of it, and I'll show you some examples where we're quite pleased with what we get. Okay. The main thing that I want to compare to, as I said earlier, is this dynamic mode decomposition. The underlying assumption, again, is that the video frames are vectorized. I know that I can't do justice to DMD with one slide, so I just tried to pick out a few things here. So the idea is ultimately, after solving, doing some pre-computations to get the components, the DMD modes, you should be able to represent each frame, the kth frame, as this kind of linear combination. These are DMD modes. The frequencies, these e to the omega t k minus 1 are, in fact, these things. Once you have this information, then there is a mechanism for peeling off what satisfies the background and what satisfies the foreground. If you have the background, which is the low frequency mode information, then you can recover the foreground information. You have to be careful with the complex numbers and things that might come out of this. But anyway, the initial work on this showed, some great results in terms of doing this separation. But we noticed that even for this very small generative model case we have, the DMD approach can't be used to exactly reconstruct that generative model, and even in that simple case. So we were curious to compare qualitatively the representations of the foreground and background estimates of BMD ALS versus matrix-based DMD, of course, as well as the compression characteristics versus the matrix-based DMD. But Fan discovered there was one other connection that we could make, actually. Just as we were able to take a slice-wise SVD of our tensor and turn it into a BM product form, it turns out that we can take the initial DMD representation and express that in a BM product form as well. So what this means is we now have two possibilities for starting guesses for our alternating least squares. We can use this truncated slice-wise SVD approach, or we can use this DMD-based representation as a starting guess for the ALS algorithm to see what we get. And it turns out in either case, on most of the examples we tried, we get some really, really great results. So the three examples that I'm showing here, we did a simulated video. So it's just a group of pixels moving around on a background. The car video I showed you earlier from MATLAB, and then this famous escalator video that gets used in a lot of these papers on separating background and foreground. In the escalator video, the escalators are moving and the people are moving in and out of the frame, but otherwise the camera's stationary. So I'm looking, first of all, at just what I would get out of the starting guess, if you will, for separating foreground and background, versus what happens if I use that as the initial guess and run BMD ALS. I'm comparing that to the DMD method only versus using DMD as an initial guess to the alternating least squares algorithm. If you know anything about using DMD for these video approaches, just to make things computationally efficient and filter out noise, you have to break the video streams into frames. So this is the data for how we did that. And but for our BMD approximations, we use the entire video sequence, and we're doing this for very small numbers, for very small BM rank. We're assuming 2 for the simulated video, 3 for the car video, and 5 for the escalator video. And we stop iterating when we either hit 150 iterations or the relative error is less than 10 to the minus 5 in the approximation. So here is just some examples of, here's our ground truth and our foreground truth. This is BMD ALS with an SVD starting guess. We almost recover this perfectly, which is good because that's kind of, we used our generative model to do this. We know we should be able to do it. On the other hand, using the DMD, we had a little bit of trouble because the starting guess kind of gave some spurious information. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little bit of oddness here where some ghost pixel information is, but it does separate fairly well. But what I'll show you on this, because this was the controlled experiment, is that we constructed this as a BM-D decomposition. So these were the lateral slices in the B and the C tensor that control the temporal information. And we recover some similar patterns when we run our algorithm using our SVD starting guess that we don't recover when we use the DMD starting guess. And you see that, there's some kind of stagnation for that starting guess, but we do fairly well for the BMD SVD. For the cars video, we've got a few frames that I've illustrated here, different frames in the different columns, the background and the foreground reconstructions. And again, you can see that the slice-wise SVD as the starting guess does not, you get a decent approximation of what the background looks like, but the foreground, not so much. You see the motion through all the slices as an artifact. But after iterating, we really can peel off just the information about the cars coming into the different frames. DMD does not suffer as much as the SVD as a starting guess in the foreground, but you see these ghosting artifacts in the background initially, but that clears up after we stop iterating. And so this is also quite a nice reconstruction after we go through the process. Likewise with the escalator video, the initial guesses are the first and the third rows. You can see some information is well resolved already with these initial guesses, not entirely surprising, but as we iterate, we are able to really resolve the motion and some high level detail, and clear up the background as well. So there's really a nice separation with both the iterative approaches, which are the second and the fourth rows here. And finally, just to say something about the compression and the relative error at once. So we have ways of measuring the compression ratio, so that in this case, the higher number is a better number. If we just use an SVD-based approach, we get the highest amount of compression, but you see, without iterating, the relative error in that first initial guess for the choice of L equals 3 is 0.12. On the other hand, if we take that initial guess and we do iterate, we give up a little bit of compression because we've got to store 3-factor tensors, but we get 0.06 for the relative error. The DMD, as I mentioned, it really wasn't initially set up to be a compression-based method. But if we use it as a starting guess and iterate, we get a very good relative error, and we see the same level of compression because we've set L to be 3 as well. Same kind of results, compression for the escalator video. Again, the iterative method really recovers well, good approximations to both the foreground and the background, and achieving high compression in both cases. So that was very nice to see. So let me just conclude. I think we've demonstrated the utility of this third order tensor BM decomposition for being able to simultaneously separate the background from the foreground, as well as compress those representations of the foreground and the background videos for these surveillance type of videos. We've given this generative model, and both the generative model and our numerical results indicate that videos with a stationary background really are naturally low BM rank tensors. And we get significant image quality improvements for these highly compressed foreground and background videos compared to existing just straight vanilla matrix-based methods. And we were able to say something about the convergence, or the convergence behavior rather, of this ALS method for BMD. Questions that remain open? Can we, is this going to work equally well for if we have objects moving at many different speeds that we're trying to resolve, different temporal resolutions rather? Can we do it, handle it in the same way as maybe, and compare it to multi-resolution based DMD methods? Certainly, we're investigating now the addition of constraints on the factorization, and we do have Gauss-Newton type approaches for resolving the BM decomposition. It's just that when the problems get very large, these are problematic, whereas our BMD ALS routine has this nice parallelizable feature. Things break down into very small subproblems, so it's much easier to run on your laptop. And although I did demonstrate this on video data, we have some other applications in mind where the BM decomposition is proving to be a natural choice that gives us features that allow us to resolve things in both variables and in time. So with that, I think I'll finish and take questions.
Great. Thanks a lot for an excellent talk. I will stop the recording, and then, yes, anyone who has a question should go ahead and ask.